Hello, and welcome to the United for Math series on plane shapes. In this lesson, students will learn how to classify lines based on certain attributes. We're going to focus on three main lines: parallel lines, perpendicular lines, and intersecting lines. And then, towards the end of the lesson, we will be able to classify them based on their specific characteristics or attributes. So let's take a look at our first example. Let's take a look at these two lines over here first. I can see that these two lines will go on forever. There's no endpoint. Next, I see that they are not intersecting. They never touch. And finally, these two lines, as they go on forever and never touch, they stay the same distance apart. So we can go ahead and classify these lines as parallel lines. So remember, parallel lines never touch. They go on forever in the same direction and they stay the same distance apart. Let's look at our perpendicular lines. Here, these lines do touch. And these lines, when they touch, these lines form a 90-degree angle or a right angle. So we can go ahead and classify these lines as perpendicular. So we have perpendicular lines. They're still going on forever, no endpoints, and where they do intersect here, they form this 90-degree angle. So remember, perpendicular lines go on forever in two directions, but they do meet, and when they meet, they form a 90-degree angle. Let's take a look at our last set of lines. Here we have two lines with no endpoints that are going on forever in two different directions. But I notice here that they do touch. And we can call these intersecting lines. Where they are intersecting at a point. And it does not form a 90-degree angle like our perpendicular lines. So now that students have worked with classifying lines, how does this relate to when we're looking at shapes and sorting shapes based on the lines? Let's take a look at some of our common 2D shapes where classifying lines would help us to then classify the shape. Here we have some common shapes. We're going to look to see if each of these shapes have parallel lines, perpendicular lines, and intersecting lines. So let's start with our triangle. Does our triangle have any parallel lines? Remember, parallel lines go on forever and do not touch. The triangle does not have any parallel lines. Next, let's look for any perpendicular lines. Remember, perpendicular lines will intersect at a point, and at that point will be a 90-degree angle. But with this triangle, it's not a right triangle, so it does not have any angles that are 90 degrees. So there are no perpendicular lines here. Next, let's look for intersecting lines. So I do see that I have lines that are going on forever in opposite directions, and they are intersecting at a point. So in fact, this triangle does have intersecting lines. Next, let's look at our rhombus. Does a rhombus have any parallel lines? And I see that this line and this line here are parallel, and this line and this line are parallel. So yes, my rhombus has parallel lines. Let's look for any perpendicular lines. Our perpendicular lines have to form a 90-degree angle, which my rhombus does not have. And finally, let's look for intersecting lines. I see that this line is going on forever in this direction, and it intersects with this line here. Now at this intersection, it's not 90 degrees, but they are still meeting at a point. So I have my intersecting lines there. Next, let's look at our square. I'm looking for parallel lines. This line here is parallel to this line, and this line is parallel to this line. So yes, my square has parallel lines. What about perpendicular lines? I can see that this line and this line do meet at a point, and that point, that angle, is 90 degrees. So we do have perpendicular lines in my square, and we actually have 4 right angles. So yes, the square does have perpendicular lines. Next, how about intersecting lines? And we do. Again, this line here intersects with this line here, and at all 4 points are intersecting. And finally, let's look at our rectangle. We have parallel lines here and here, and then my parallel line here and here. Next, perpendicular lines. Do we have lines that intersect and form 90-degree angles? And we do. My line here and here intersects to form 90 degrees, another 90 degrees, 90 degrees, another right angle here. So yes, my rectangle has perpendicular lines. And we also have intersecting lines because they are intersecting at a point. It just happens that it forms a right angle. So students will begin to see how classifying lines can really help them when they're trying to identify shapes. So to recap, we have 3 different types of lines. Our parallel lines that are 2 lines that go on forever in opposite directions. They never touch and they stay the same distance apart. Then we have perpendicular lines that are 2 lines that go on forever in 2 different directions. And when they do touch, they form a 90-degree angle, or we call that a right angle. And finally, intersecting lines are 2 lines that intersect or touch at a point. We look forward to seeing you in our next lesson, where we will be classifying angles. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.